They said the woman who lived at Sunset Hollow owned everything her eyes could see. 4,000 acres, 50 head of cattle, and more men under her employ than the local sheriff had deputies. And yet that morning, as she rode along the eastern fence line with her black riding gloves and dustless boots, she stopped cold at the sight of a barefoot woman standing just inside her boundary, staring out over her land as if it were familiar. The ranch woman, Clarabelle Dunn, widow to the late Walter Dunn, and still courted by half the bankers in the county, pulled her horse to a slow stop, adjusting her hat as if that might steady her temper. The woman across the fence was tall, giant even, her skin sun-worn, her arms crossed beneath a faded wool shawl, her bare feet planted so firm in the earth it made Clarabelle's stirrups feel foolish. "You're on private property," Clarabelle called, trying to keep her voice firm, not startled. But the Apache woman didn't answer. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look away. She just kept her gaze fixed on something past the ranch, as if she'd already been here longer than the fences themselves. Clarabelle climbed down, boot heels hitting dirt with more confidence than conviction. "Do you speak English?" she asked, louder now. The silence that followed wasn't defiance. It felt older than that, like the land itself was pausing. Finally, the woman turned, not fast, not slow, and met her eyes. There was no fear there, no challenge, no apology, just a gaze that made Clarabelle shift her weight without meaning to. "You live here?" Clarabelle asked, suddenly unsure if the question even made sense. The woman looked at the hills, then back to her, and gave the smallest nod. Clarabelle blinked. "This is Dunn Ranch, always has been." The woman didn't argue. She didn't need to. Because something in her stillness, something in the way she stood like the wind would move around her, not through her, made Clarabelle realize that this wasn't intrusion. It was return. She looked down at the woman's feet, dusty, cracked, unmoving, and something in her chest pulled back, the way a horse does when you try to yank too hard on the reins. Clarabelle cleared her throat, suddenly unsure whether to shout, to demand, or to listen. In the distance, the ranch dog barked twice. The air shifted. And for the first time in years, Clarabelle Dunn, who owned so much land she couldn't remember its edges, felt like she was standing at the border of something she didn't understand, but maybe needed to. Clarabelle didn't tell anyone that night about the barefoot Apache woman near the fence, not even when Carl, her foreman, asked why she'd come back from the ride early with dust still fresh on her boots, and a silence she usually saved for court hearings. Instead, she sat alone at the supper table, untouched ham cooling on her plate, as the oil lamp flickered shadows along the pine-paneled walls. Something about the woman's stillness had gotten inside her, like a root working under the surface, slow and quiet, but certain. At dawn, she rode back, half expecting the figure to be gone, swallowed up by whatever dreams the plains left behind. But there she was again, this time kneeling by the creek that cut through the eastern edge, her hands dipped in the water like she was praying or remembering. Clarabelle stayed hidden behind a mesquite, watching. The woman scooped water in her palms and let it fall back in slow streams. A few feet away lay a cloth bundle, maybe food, maybe nothing. Clarabelle wanted to call out, to remind her of borders and deeds and ownership, but instead she stepped forward and made a sound in her throat that wasn't a word, but wasn't quite empty. The Apache woman looked up, eyes calm, unbothered. Clarabelle held out a canteen she'd brought this time, unsure why. "It's cleaner than creek water," she muttered, arm extended. The woman looked at it, then at her, then reached slowly, not cautious, not desperate, just aware, and took it without a thank you, but also without offense. She drank long and deep, and when she handed it back, Clarabelle noticed her fingers were calloused the way men's hands got during calving season. "Where are you from?" she asked. The woman paused, then turned her face to the ridgeline behind them. "There," she said, voice low, shaped by the earth more than the tongue. Clarabelle followed the gaze and felt a chill, because behind that ridge was an old trail her husband had once warned her never to ride alone. "Ain't nothing there now but scrub?" Clarabelle whispered. The woman blinked slowly, then said, "It was never nothing." For a second, neither moved. Then Clarabelle did something she hadn't done in years. She sat down on the dirt, canteen beside her, knees stiff, skirt wrinkling like it didn't matter. The woman didn't move closer, but she didn't walk away either. They sat in the hush between ranch and memory, between deed and dust, between a woman who thought she owned land and one who remembered when no one did. Clarabelle looked down at her boots and suddenly wished she'd taken them off. Clarabelle returned the next morning, not with a rifle or a question, but with something strange even to herself. Bare feet, her good boots slung over the horn of her saddle as she walked the last stretch through the dry grass, letting the cool earth press against her soles like it had something to teach. The Apache woman was already there, standing by the same creek, facing the sun like she knew it better than people. Clarabelle stopped a few feet away and didn't speak, didn't wave, didn't demand. She just set the boots down between them, a silent offering. Not pity, not trade, just boots. The woman looked at them, then at Clarabelle, her gaze neither warm nor sharp, only deep. She didn't move, but her fingers brushed against the smooth leather after a while, testing the stitching, the worn heel. Clarabelle stood still, arms at her sides, heart beating too loudly for such a quiet gesture. The woman didn't take the boots. She pushed them gently back toward Clarabelle with her foot, then knelt and untied her own crude wrappings, strips of hide hardened by dust and sun, and dipped her bare feet into the stream. Clarabelle didn't speak, didn't ask. Instead, she walked to the water's edge, mirrored the motion, and lowered her own feet into the current beside the woman's. The silence held. A crow passed overhead. Somewhere in the brush, a steer lowed. And in that wordless stretch of time, two women who came from different scars sat with their skin touching the same cold stream. There was no smile, no nod, no bridge built, but there was no wall either. When the woman rose, she left her old wraps by the bank and walked away barefoot. Not toward the hills, but deeper into Clarabelle's land, past the cattle fence that marked the eastern boundary. Clarabelle didn't stop her. Instead, she picked up the boots she'd brought, tied them back to her saddle, and walked home with nothing on her feet but questions. That evening, she told Carl not to post guards on the east line. "Just let it breathe," she said, which made no sense to him, but he nodded anyway. Something in her voice had changed. Clarabelle hadn't planned on speaking to the foreman that night, but when she stepped into the kitchen and found Carl drinking from her good decanter with his boots on the rug, something snapped loose in her chest. Not anger, but clarity, the same kind that had made her take off her own boots that morning. "You didn't patrol the east like I said," she murmured. Carl didn't look up. "I did," he replied, slow and pointed. "Didn't see a soul." She knew he was lying. There was tension in the room now, thick as gristle. Carl had worked the ranch 10 years, but not once had he looked her in the eye unless it was payday. And tonight, when he finally did, it wasn't with respect. It was with something else. "I seen her, Clarabelle," he said, tapping the glass. "That Apache woman's out past the well line. I don't care if you think she's just wandering. You bring one in, you bring the rest. That's how it starts." Clarabelle stepped closer, slow and deliberate, and for the first time in a long while, she let silence speak before she did. "And if I bring in someone who ain't been fed or clothed right, that starts something too. But maybe it starts the right kind of fire." Carl scoffed. "You think they'll thank you for it? That woman don't want saving, Clarabelle. She wants claim." That landed harder than a slap, because part of her, a deep, buried part, knew he wasn't completely wrong. The Apache woman hadn't looked lost that morning. She looked like she belonged. "You can go," Clarabelle said simply. "At dawn, ride north. Take what's yours. Leave what's not." Carl laughed once, cruel and dry. "You don't get to fire me for speaking plain." Clarabelle walked past him, opened the back door, and tossed his saddle roll onto the porch. "That wasn't plain," she said. "That was small, and I ain't building anything small on this land." Behind her, Carl didn't move, but the tension shifted, and when she looked back, she saw it. The look of a man who realized the house was no longer his to command. She walked upstairs without another word, heart pounding louder than her boots on the wood floor. And when she lay down, she dreamed of a woman at a riverbank. Barefoot, unbent, unafraid. The frost had lifted by mid-morning, and Clarabelle took a basket of linen to the west pasture, walking slow, not to spy but to understand. Because ever since she'd stood over Carl in the kitchen, something in her wanted proof that she hadn't acted out of pride. But as she rounded the corner past the fence post where the cattle rarely strayed, she saw her again, the Apache woman, kneeling in the grass, her long legs folded beneath her like a statue carved out of storm clouds, hands pressed to her side in a way Clarabelle recognized not as prayer, but pain. The woman's braid was frayed at the ends, dirt smudged her temple, and when she leaned forward to press something into the earth, maybe a root, maybe just her breath, Clarabelle noticed the dark bloom spreading beneath her waistband. It wasn't fresh blood, but it was blood. And no one bled from the ribs that slow unless they were hiding something deep and cracked beneath, a wound left to fester because there'd been no trust in sight. Clarabelle didn't call out, didn't run, didn't even gasp. She simply walked forward as if she belonged in that field too, and when the woman looked up, startled but not afraid, she knelt beside her and set the linen basket down between them like a peace offering carved from cotton and warmth. "You got hurt bad," she said, voice low but not soft, and the woman nodded once, eyes clear, face unreadable. She didn't ask for help, but Clarabelle reached anyway, slow as dusk, lifting the hem just enough to see a jagged tear above her left hip, crusted and deep, like it had been stitched once by someone who ran out of thread. Or time. "This needs to be cleaned," Clarabelle said. And when the woman didn't move, she added, "You can keep your blade nearby if that's what it takes. But I got a basin and clean rags up at the house, and no one there but me and the quiet." And after a long breath, the woman finally nodded again, more tired than trusting, but enough. Together they stood, neither helping the other, but neither alone. And by the time they reached the porch steps, the sun was breaking through the sycamore branches like it had been waiting too. Clarabelle held the door open, and when the woman entered, she did so without pause, tall frame brushing the wood like she'd passed through homes before, but never one this still, this willingly given. Clarabelle set the basin by the hearth, lit the lamp, and without saying a word, dipped the cloth and began the slow work of cleaning someone else's pain without demanding the story behind it. The woman winced once, but didn't pull back, and that, more than anything, felt like a conversation between them, one made of steam, blood, and the hush of a house that had never hosted such truth. The fire had burned low by the time Clarabelle finished wrapping the woman's ribs with fresh linen, her fingers careful but unshaking, and when she stood to pour another kettle of water for tea, the Apache woman remained seated on the woven mat by the hearth, legs folded, eyes half lowered, not in submission but in awareness, as if every flicker of flame told her where she was, who had touched her, and why it hadn't felt like a claim. Outside, the wind sighed through the shutters, and though Clarabelle had no plans to speak, something about the hush invited truth, not loud or forced, but steady, like bread rising in a still kitchen. "I had a brother once," she said, pouring the water slow, "but he died in a stampede when I was 20. And no one looked me in the eye after that without seeing a shadow I didn't put there." And she didn't know why she'd told that to someone who hadn't even given a name. But the woman looked up, just a little, and nodded like the rhythm made sense, even if the words didn't. Clarabelle handed her the tin cup without ceremony, and when their fingers brushed, the woman didn't flinch, just took it in both hands like it had weight that went beyond heat or liquid. They sat like that for what felt like hours, sharing nothing and everything while the house softened around them. No horses in the barn tonight, no boots stomping past windows, just wind, fire, linen, and two women whose lives had never been meant to cross, but had done so anyway, without ceremony. At some point, Clarabelle unfolded the wool blanket from the rocker and draped it gently over the woman's legs, not mothering her, just covering what the house couldn't. And when the woman's hand gripped the edge in silent thanks, it wasn't a gesture of submission. It was alliance, forged without oath or demand. Neither of them moved when the fire dimmed, and neither said goodnight, because nights like this weren't about parting. They were about deciding what would not be undone come morning. Clarabelle leaned back in her chair and let her hands rest on her lap, bare and still, while the woman closed her eyes with the calm of someone who had finally found four walls that didn't expect anything in return. Outside, the stars had come out, bright, unapologetic, and somewhere beyond the hills, a hawk called once, like a distant echo of the life both women had survived to get here. And in that cabin, under a patchwork roof and beside a fire that needed no more stoking, two strangers passed from fear to stillness, not by choice, but by shared presence. And it was enough. Clarabelle was setting bread on the windowsill when a familiar creak in the gate made her spine stiffen, not from fear, but from memory. And when she turned, it wasn't a storm or a shadow she faced, but Everett Langdon, the ranch hand from across the ridge, the one who'd once courted her out of boredom more than want, and now stood in her yard like he still had some piece of it in his pocket. "Wasn't expecting company," she said, not unkindly, but with the firmness of a woman who no longer asked who brought news, only who deserved to give it. Everett tipped his hat, but his eyes were already on the Apache woman by the porch. She stood barefoot, shawl draped over her shoulders, the blanket from last night still folded in her arms, not hiding, not posturing, just present, and it was that quiet strength that unsettled him more than any spear or war paint could have. "You all right, Clarabelle?" he asked, as if the presence of another soul on her land could only mean danger or weakness, and she saw the doubt curled behind his voice like a worm in ripe fruit. "She was hurt," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, "and I had space," which to her was explanation enough, but Everett shifted, unsure whether to scold, warn, or retreat. The Apache woman said nothing, but her gaze met his without blink or bow, and in that brief silence between three hearts, something old and false cracked in the air, like the assumption that every white man was owed an answer, and every native woman owed shame. "She one of the ones that raided Sims's cattle last spring?" he asked, and Clarabelle stepped down from the porch not to confront, but to stand beside, shoulder to shoulder with the woman who had not asked for defense, only decency. "I'm not keeping accounts," Clarabelle replied. I'm feeding a woman who is bleeding at my door. What are you here for, Everett? Bread or blame?" And her words didn't rise, but they rooted deep, like fence posts sunk straight through years of silence. Everett opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded once. Not at her, not at the woman, but perhaps at the truth between them. And without another word, he turned, boots crunching gravel, and left the same way he'd come, empty-handed but not unchanged. Inside, the cabin was warm again, and the woman placed the blanket back on the rocker like she knew this place wasn't a pause. It was a shift. Clarabelle looked at the quiet room, at the table that had 2 cups now instead of 1, and understood that Everett had seen more than a guest. He'd seen a threshold crossed, one that didn't burn the house down, only lit a new lamp in it. And outside, as his horse trotted away without urgency, the wind changed direction. Soft and low, as if the land itself had exhaled something long held in. They came in pairs first. Mrs. Kinley and her gossip-heavy daughter, then old Reverend Moore with his coat too hot for spring, then the Cravens from the tannery who never turned down a reason to stare. And by midday, it was clear that this wasn't a neighborly call, but a quiet tribunal dressed up in Sunday decency. Clarabelle had seen these gatherings before, years ago when her father hired a Mexican foreman and the town threatened boycott, and again when her sister wore blue ribbon before marriage, and people crossed the street for months. This time, the offense was quieter but just as loud. The Apache woman stood near the barn door, mending a leather halter like she'd lived there a decade, not a week, and the way she didn't flinch under stares made Clarabelle's blood run both hot with pride and cold with fear. Reverend Moore was the first to speak, his voice rounded with the kind of concern that hides its claws in Scripture, saying things like appearances and wisdom and influence on the children, though everyone knew Clarabelle had none, except this woman, who had slept under her roof and eaten from her pot and swept her porch without being asked. "You've got space, Clarabelle," Mrs. Kinley offered, all sweet sting. "But not everything belongs in every space." And behind her, the Cravens murmured agreement like pigs rooting the same trough. Clarabelle didn't shout, didn't fold, just looked them each in the eye and said, "Didn't realize kindness needed committee approval," and the silence after that was deep and real until a sound broke it. Hooves, heavy and many, and heads turned to the road where a line of riders approached from the east. At first there was fear. Rifles clutched, hats tipped down. But it wasn't a war party, not a raid. Just 12 Apache men in dusty coats and wide saddles, their faces unreadable, their pace deliberate. They didn't dismount, only stopped at the edge of the yard, and one of them, tall and lined with years, nodded once to the woman near the barn. She returned the nod, then walked to Clarabelle's side and stood, not behind her, not in front, but beside. The old Apache raised his hand slowly and spoke, not in English, but his tone was unmistakable. Not threat, not plea, just thanks. And then they turned, all 12, and rode off without pause. The townsfolk didn't speak for a long moment, and it was Mrs. Kinley who finally said, "Well, that's that," though no one knew what she meant. By sunset, the crowd had gone, muttering about weather and pies and how things used to be better, but no one asked Clarabelle to put the woman out, and no one offered help either. Still, the message was clear. If she kept this path, she'd walk it without their blessing. Clarabelle didn't mind, because when the last wagon wheel faded into dust and the porch creaked under 2 chairs again, she knew this was no longer about one woman's guest. It was about whose dignity could survive judgment, and whose didn't need it. 2 mornings later, when Clarabelle came down the front steps with her coffee steaming and her boots only half-laced, she found the Apache woman already out by the corral, bare-handed and knee-deep in mud, dragging a broken post into place while the gelding watched like it knew better than to interfere. The woman didn't ask for tools or wait for help. She just worked, slow and steady, her braid dark with dust, and her skirt hitched above the knees with rough twine. Clarabelle didn't speak at first, only leaned on the porch rail and watched, the way one might watch rain fall after a drought, unsure whether to trust it or run for buckets. When the post was set and the rope tied, the woman looked up with a breath that shook the sweat from her jaw, and Clarabelle said, "You're not temporary, are you?" And the woman, whose name she still hadn't asked, tilted her head, not as question, but like a tree hearing its roots spoken of. Clarabelle moved toward her slowly, boots sinking in wet earth, and offered the name first. "Clarabelle Grace," she said. Not like a badge, more like an open door, and the woman nodded once, then said, "Tessalina." Her voice so soft it sounded like the name had to ask permission to be heard. "That short for something?" Clarabelle asked, but Tessalina only shrugged, as if it didn't matter, or maybe as if it had never belonged to a language Clarabelle could understand. They didn't speak again until the horses calmed and the sky grew wide with afternoon, and by then there was a rhythm between them. Chores shared without asking. Glances exchanged like silent sentences. The change came when a boy arrived with a letter. Henry Lawton's son, the banker's youngest, red in the cheeks and nervous, holding an envelope like it might bite him. "Mama said this is for whoever's in charge now," he said, eyes darting between the two women, unsure who to hand it to. Clarabelle reached for it, but before she could open it, the boy blurted, They're saying you're keeping a warrior's widow," and then he ran off without waiting for a response. Tessalina didn't flinch, didn't blink, just looked at the envelope in Clarabelle's hands, and then turned back toward the barn. "Wait," Clarabelle called, voice sharper than she meant it, and Tessalina paused. "Is it true?" she asked, stepping close. "You married?" Tessalina looked at her then, not guarded, not ashamed, just tired in a way that made Clarabelle want to sit down and listen for an hour. "I was," Tessalina said, then added, "He died 4 winters ago, defending children who weren't ours, so now I live where I'm needed, not where I'm told." The wind moved then, lifting dust and quiet, and Clarabelle felt something shift deep in the ribs, a name settling into her land, not with ceremony but with truth. She folded the letter and tucked it into her coat without reading it, then turned to Tessalina and said, "Well, he married someone worth remembering, so stay if you want. The land knows your name now, even if the town forgets it. It rained soft that night, not enough to flood, just enough to turn the dust to a balm and the air to something that made the lungs feel mended. By morning, everything smelled of cedar smoke and damp wheat, and the world outside Clarabelle's ranch house looked brushed clean, like it had been repainted while they slept. Tessalina was already outside when Clarabelle came down, the hem of her dress still wet from walking through the grass, her braid thicker now, tied with a piece of red cloth that hadn't been there before. Maybe old, maybe sacred, maybe just hers. Clarabelle didn't say anything, just poured 2 tin cups of coffee and handed one over without fuss, the way women do when no words are needed. They sat on the edge of the porch, boots touching mud, eyes following the trail where wagon ruts had started to fade into soft earth. And from somewhere behind the house came the clatter of the new gate Henry Lawton had sent over with no note, just wood, hinges, and apology built into every nail. Clarabelle had let it be installed 2 days ago, hadn't said yes or no, but the gesture stayed anyway, quiet as forgiveness. Tessalina sipped her coffee like someone who understood rituals even when they weren't hers, and Clarabelle finally asked, "You ever think of leaving again?" And Tessalina just gave a half smile, slow and solid, then said, "Only when I forget what stillness feels like." The wind picked up just enough to rattle the corn stalks and carry the smell of horses from the barn, and Clarabelle watched the horizon for a long moment before whispering, "I used to think I owned this land, bought it, fenced it, named it, but it never softened until you walked it barefoot." Tessalina looked down at her feet, still bare, toes muddy, then pressed them into the soil a little deeper, like claiming something wordlessly. "You still own it," she said, "but now it listens to you." By midday, a group of children wandered up the hill. 3 Lakota girls and 1 freckled boy with a broken hoop wheel. None of them strangers, none of them asking permission, just drawn by the smell of stew and the sight of a woman who had once scared their fathers, but now poured them bowls without judgment. Clarabelle opened the screen door and waved them in, calling out, "Soup's hot, wash your hands." And when she turned back, Tessalina was already at the well, drawing another bucket, sleeves rolled high, eyes soft and shining with something that looked like peace, but felt like prayer. They didn't need a sign or a paper deed, just the sound of laughter under their roof and the earth beneath their feet no longer hard from fighting. In town, people still whispered, but no one came up the road anymore, not since the letter from Henry and the silence that followed. The ranch stayed theirs, not because it was unchallenged, but because it had finally been seen, respected, and shared, and in a world full of land that hated to be held, that was rare enough to call holy. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you saw a woman walk barefoot across your land with nothing but silence, would you have listened or turned her away? Tell us in the comments.